What's up, Internet? We are here for that time of year once again. The one where we look back and try and find some goodness in the world, because there certainly is less and less by the day, it seems. Either way, in spite of all the horrible things going on in life, there's always video games. And here is the list of the top 10 best games of 2024. Now, if you're new here, first of all, hi. But second of all, this is a list of my favorite games that I played for the first time this year. Not necessarily games that came out this year, because if we stuck to stuff that came out this year, it would be a very boring list, and I don't think I played that many games that came out this year. None of them looked all that interesting to me, if I'm being honest. But yeah, list of best games I got to play this year. Hopefully we'll find some new stuff that you can enjoy as well. Before we get into the list proper, let's take a look at two honorable mentions I have this time. Honorable mention number A, going to Neon White. This is a really awesome game mechanically speaking. It is a fast-paced first-person shooter where you pick up new weapons and then discard them, in doing so giving you different movement options to try and get through the environments faster. It's a very speedrun heavy game that manages to juggle gunplay, resource management, and parkour all in one, and it is just a fast, stylish, good time. And it feels just so viscerally fun to move around and figure out exactly the way each level flows, because you're just flying through a level so fast and everything just feels so natural once everything clicks into place. And there's like a lot of theory crafting to the levels as well, because to get the higher ranks, you have to get like a high score on the level, right? But most of the time, in order to do that, you have to kill all the enemies in a level and also do it faster than by thinking outside of the box and outside of your normal tool set. And you have to find a different way to get through the levels using shortcuts that pretty much require you to ignore a chunk of the critical path in front of you, effectively forcing you to ignore the level to get through the level. I loved just sitting there on my first runs of this, trying to think, okay, here's where I can find that shortcut that's gonna get me the most time saved, or maybe I can do this with my abilities in this sort of order of operations in order to get the best times. This game gets really engrossing when you start going for the high scores, and it just feels so good that the hours can melt away just trying to save a few seconds. I'm not a speedrunner, but this game kind of makes it feel like it, and it makes you feel real cool when you get something right. This is an absolutely amazing game for the Steam Deck, because it's such a great game to pop in, play a level or two, try and beat some high scores, and get a better time overall. If you're the kind of person who likes to try and get the high score or beat a, developer time, or just in general be the best out of your friends, you will sink an absolute crap ton of time into Neon White. I know I certainly got hooked into just trying to beat developer times and stuff in this game, and it was a lot of fun. And if you're an explorer, well, there's tons of secrets as well that will definitely make you stop, scratch your head, and just ask yourself, how am I supposed to get up there exactly? Like seriously, knowing all the moves in my toolbox, I still got lost in trying to figure out how to get some of the collectibles in this game. It was a lot of fun. That said, the writing is terrible, and that sucks because they actually had some decent voice talent for it. I mean, it's got Steve Flippin' Bloom in it, but the writing is just awful, so maybe skip all of the story and just stay for the gameplay. It is an absolute treat when you just break it down to a mechanical experience. Absolutely top tier game. Honorable mention number B goes to...
You're on a path in the woods, and at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
Slay the princess. Now, I've gone on record as saying that I absolutely hate, with a passion, visual novel games. So it says something that this was a visual novel game that had me engrossed from beginning to end, and I had to see where this story goes. I don't want to necessarily call this a minimalist game, because it's actually a surprisingly huge game when you actually start playing it, but it's a game that really only has like 2 rooms to tell a story in. A room right outside a cabin, and a room in a cabin's basement. And the story progresses as time goes on. And the game remembers your decisions and will actively judge you for them. I remember the first time I played this, I was actively being the contrarian that I always am and refused to actually take part in this princess slaying endeavor, only to find myself somehow back where I started with a new voice in my head who was super snarky and basically my best friend. Seriously, I loved this game. I love the characters they introduce, even though there's really only like 3, and the writing and acting are so engaging and well done. It was really fun to just listen to the story that was unfolding before me because it was just presented so well and acted so well. It is a gripping visual novel, which I never thought would ever be a thing I could ever experience. And with its scratchy monochrome designs that are kind of ever shifting depending on the choices you make, it is just endlessly engaging to see what choices and what your actions will end up creating. This is a brilliant game, and if you have any interest in visual novels, this one's a no-brainer. And I loved all the different ways it took the story, and it goes in some really disturbing directions. And for the record, I did throw the dagger out the window. Rule of 3 and all that. Anyway, going on to our list proper, we have number 10. Athenian Rhapsody. This was a game I had been following for quite a while. It was an interesting idea. This was an RPG where every choice you made, everything you did, every character you interacted with, all the things you did over the course of your playthrough would be quantified and then condensed into a singular object that summarized it all. And then you could trade it away and remix it with other people and just show people what your story was just with this one item that was you. It was a cool idea. And honestly, if it didn't have such a rough launch, and I think it was a little bit more varied in how it approached that, I would have given it an even higher spot. The fact is, if you had a Steam Deck, this game was kind of unplayable for 2 months. One of the biggest mechanics of this game was the fact that it was going to have special events that you could just download and have access to forever, provided you download it within the time frame. Unfortunately, this feature didn't work on the Steam Deck, and they decided to launch an event anyway. Now, they did eventually fix it before the event ended, but still, that meant that for a month, you just didn't have access to this special limited time DLC that you might not have actually ever had full access to because the time frame might have been missed entirely. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but it was just a really rough launch, and that's kind of sad. I think this game will be frequently compared to something like Undertale. I mean, from what I've seen, it is frequently compared to Undertale, and I think that's going to end very unfavorably, because the fact is, Undertale was an interesting game that had bright, lighthearted humor that had a very deep message at the end of the day. Similar to, say, Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass from last year. And this game kinda tries to do that, but it doesn't really get to its deep, meaningful message until the 11th hour, when up to that point it's mostly been very, very loud ADHD sound effects and also random internet humor that it kind of feels a little half-hearted by the end. I like the message and I like where it goes, but I feel like it was focusing so much on the goofy tone that it doesn't really succeed when it actually tries to be serious, and it kind of comes across as too little too late. And for a game that was more or less an RPG that had combat that was heavily inspired by effectively WarioWare, it didn't have all that much variation to the actual combat so much. Especially compared to its own demo, I feel like they could have just done more with having more interesting and more varied experiences in actually combating foes. That said, it's still basically WarioWare meets Undertale, and that's actually pretty fun. And the idea of creating an item that basically summarizes your entire experience and then seeing how other people did, seeing how your friends did, sending it away to the developer to get them to actually create a physical one for you for a price I probably can't afford, but I would love to do that. That's an interesting idea, and the fact is, this game was a memorable experience. I'm 1.5 playthroughs in on this already, and I kind of want to see all these weird events, and I want to be kept up to date with it. I just wish there was a little bit more going on, and it worked a little bit better than it did, especially at launch. But that said, Athenian Rhapsody, that was a really interesting experience this year, and I loved it. Number 9. Drova. This one came completely out of left field, and if it wasn't for the publisher sending me a code, I would have never played this game. I hear that this game frequently gets compared to Gothic, and I don't really know what that actually means because the only Gothic game I ever played had its Gothicness legally removed from it. So I don't know if this is like Gothic or not, but what I do know is it is a dark, dreary, interesting world where I got lost in it for actual real-time days, going on random quests and ending up on the other side of the map just completely lost. In over my head, fighting enemies that were massively above me, getting by the skin of my teeth, using interesting, less than standard ways of character interaction to try and get by all this. It was an interesting RPG that makes me feel like it's a bit Soulsy in its approach to actual combat. It has interesting character dynamics where your actions will actually be brought up by everyone if they're involved. Like I said in my review of this, I once went on a bender with like this general guy, and everyone in town was talking about it pretty much forever. It even has some really fun combat options. When I finished my review, I actually found like this artifact that made all of my bare knuckle punches instant crit, and then I found a way to like augment that with like additional bleeding damage and stuff. And even though I'd spent several hours learning how to be a spear fighter, I was suddenly a bare knuckle brawler pretty much until the end of the game, and that was just an absolute blast. Drova is dark, it is dreary, it is creepy, it is atmospheric as all hell, and it is a huge, varied adventure that will leave you with all sorts of interesting stories to tell. And there's stories about like the experiences you have during the game, and that was so much fun to me. This game came out of nowhere for me, and I have to say it was one of the cooler RPGs I played this year. Drova, definitely a very special RPG, and I'm still very thankful I just randomly happened to get a key for it. Number 8. Tunic! The adventures of Tunic the Squirrel trying to rescue his ghost mum, or something. This game, it captures the spirit of something that I hold very near and dear to my heart. I'm an importer. I like to play weird imported games, and I like archiving games, and part of that is because it makes me feel like an archaeologist, finding hidden treasure and trying to decipher languages that are beyond human comprehension, because seriously, who actually understands Japanese? No one. It's just a fact, no one knows actual Japanese language. This game captures that experience perfectly. You start in this world, and it's a beautiful, quaint little Zelda-style game that is immediately ridiculously hostile and plays like a Souls game. You have no idea what's going on. You have no idea what you're supposed to do, and what little text there is in this game is in a made-up language, so good luck. Over the course of the game, you'll find little bits of the manual to this game that will let you kinda sorta decipher what's supposed to go on through basic problem solving and logical consistency between what you see in game and what you see in the manual, but the manual is also in this fictional language, so again, you have to think about what you're doing as you go. And this game will just gleefully withhold information from you that is entirely available to you from the start. And if you just didn't figure it out, that's on you for not being smart enough to just test everything and figure everything out. I kind of love that. This game is full of secrets and stuff as well. Like right at the start, there's a hidden room that will let you change Tunic the Squirrel's colors and everything. And there's a secret in there too. There is so much here, and when you think you've finally wrapped your head around what Tunic actually is, it is happy to flip the script on you and basically turn your entire world upside down and give you a completely new game. It's kind of amazing how much this game is an experience in just trying to figure things out, and how much this game challenges your ability to make logical, consistent connections to make things work. It's a game that will frequently challenge your preconceived notions as to how this game works and what you should be doing and what you think you're doing. It's kind of an amazing little game, and it's such a chill experience for a game that's basically a Souls game. It is just a ridiculously great game for the Steam Deck. That said, you'll also note that this is on the latter half of the list, and there's a reason for that. Puzzles. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase. Puzzle. If you've beaten this game to 100%, you know exactly which puzzle I'm talking about. But there is one puzzle in this game that when I solved it, I didn't feel smart. I didn't feel happy about it. I just felt angry. Unfortunately, the cute, quirky little adventure game that's kind of soulsy and involves you sort of challenging what you know about games and what you know about yourself to actually like make the game work properly and make advancements in this game, yeah, that gets dashed for a really dumb puzzle by the end, and it's frustrating. And that one puzzle is honestly knocking this game down several pegs for me. But it's still an amazing experience. I've played through this game twice now. I had a lot of fun. I don't think I'll ever do that puzzle again, but I could see myself picking this game up again, just because it's really engrossing to explore this world and see all this weird stuff and just trying to understand what it is that's going on around you with really just the context of what's happening to go off of. This game is an experience, and as someone who plays games specifically for the experience, this game did a lot for me, and it was so memorable. Number 7 on our list, Fire Striker. This is a fairly obscure and relatively rare Super Nintendo game. It's a breakout game, and that's a whole mess of red flags for me right here, but this game also gets an award for being the second breakout kind of game I actually enjoyed. It's a breakout style game that's framed as a fantasy adventure. You get different characters that have different abilities that can challenge different areas, so that you can ultimately defeat evil at the end of the day. It's not a complicated plot by any means. The thing I don't like about it though is the physics physics are not great, and ball control suffers greatly because of it, which actually makes this game kinda hard to play. That said, I think the concept of a medieval breakout style game in a fantasy setting with interesting monsters and characters carries this, and makes it still a game that might be worth trying to play. Just maybe don't spend the hundreds of dollars this game now costs, because that's way too much. But it was one of the more noteworthy Super Nintendo games I've played this year. Number 6 on our list, I'm actually playing as we speak. This is Lunar Lux. I'm not gonna lie, I picked this game up to record 2 minutes of footage, and that was about 13 hours ago, and I've basically just sat down and played through it again for a second time in a single sitting because this game was so great. This game is kind of amazing. It is a fantasy-style game that is kind of like a fan sequel to Mega Man Battle Network with combat that's sort of mixed in a little bit from WarioWare. It's sort of awesome like that. I'm not gonna lie, the combat is the thing that really drew me to this game, just because it does mix the card deck building of Battle Network, but in kind of a twisted way. Every turn in combat, you actually have access to every ability that's available to you, but you can only pick one. And then you further augment that with a random stat buff that's pulled from a deck that you've modified. That's really interesting. You can combine abilities and do super attacks, and if you combine the right ones, they actually do like a super rare attack. That's pretty cool. Defense suddenly then becomes kind of WarioWare. Are you defending? Are you avoiding? I just found the gameplay to this really, really engrossing. The story itself is a fun little fantasy romp where you are fighting against some evil monsters from space, but there's kind of a whole thing going on with that. It's interesting, but as much as I do like this game and how I've spent the entire past day just playing this again because I enjoy it so much, I do feel like there's a big issue with this game, and that is I feel like it's probably trying to be a bigger game than it actually is, or rather it was designed to be a bigger game and then kind of had to be walked back. And I say this for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a side quest very early on to stop some pirates, and when you do that, you can go take a look at their computer, and you'll even say, hey, they're on like this huge communication network. If we go after all these pirates, eventually their leader will take notice of us. These pirates then proceed to not be part of the game until the penultimate chapter, where then you just sort of rock up and go fight the leader. I don't know what that is. 60% the way through the game, you are still getting new mechanics that are getting introduced to you. At the end of the penultimate chapter, you suddenly get like half the abilities of the game dumped into your lap in one dungeon for some reason. Unfortunately, this game feels like it's probably supposed to be a lot bigger than it is, and the fact that it's not that big is kind of heartbreaking because this game is awesome. I like the character designs, I like the combat. The story itself is not too surprising, it's pretty by the numbers, but I think it works fairly well, and the writing itself is excellent. I want more of it because it's really, really well made, and for a small bite-sized indie RPG, Lunar Lux is awesome. All I can do is hope that this game gets a sequel or an expansion, or the people who made it decide to take this idea and expand it further, because the fact is there is so much good here that just feels like it needs to be more and bigger, because it's doing basically everything right, but it just doesn't have the scope anymore. Also, this game makes a Goty reference, and I'm legally required to love everything that does that, so yeah, Lunar Lux, it's pretty awesome. Number 5. Automaton Lung. This game, to me, was like a missed connection. It was a 3DS exclusive game that I learned about literally the day before the 3DS eShop went down, and I made a point to buy it, and then promptly forgot to do that because I have the memory of a piece of styrofoam. Fortunately, randomly going through Steam, I came across this game and bought it, and it wasn't until I was basically done with it that I realized it was the same game I had missed like a year before. This game I could probably best describe as Jet Force Gemini meets LSD Dream Emulator. It's a third-person sci-fi shooter that starts you in this mysterious empty tower that I then exited to find this bizarrely empty city. I tried to hop on a platform to jump up onto a platform to get a collectible, only to find myself in the middle of this bizarre desert flying a big bug. And that was just the start. This is a game that has more questions than it does answers, and it's all about exploring this bizarre alien world that is entirely indifferent to you existing, and trying to figure out what happened, or more accurately not, and just collecting a bunch of collectibles. But the fact is that this game was interesting, and for about a week, this was the only thing I wanted to think about. It was such a fun, different kind of experience that just let me explore a world and try and uncover all these mysteries. And like I said, I like to feel a bit like an archaeologist when I play these games, and this gave me that experience 100%. I still don't know what the end ending to this game is all about, and the hoverboard is kind of terrible, and most of the weapons are useless, but Automaton Lung gets it right where it matters, exploring a weird alien world and trying to piece together things that might ultimately not even piece together. If you're an explorer in games, this is an absolute must-have. It is such a strange, surreal experience. It was totally worth the pickup. Number 4, Kenshi. Alright, I'm just gonna level with you. Kenshi is one of the greatest PC games I have ever played. Now, that's coming from someone who isn't primarily a PC gamer, and most of my PC gaming is done on a Steam Deck because of it, but this game was absolutely amazing. This is a game about stories. It is a game about your story. Who are you? Well, you're probably not some sort of hero of legend. You're in a world that is largely uncaring for you. Whether you live or die, whether your limbs get eaten off by giant bird monsters, or your skin ripped off by robots who want to wear it so they can blend into humanity more, to just being thrown into slave pits. The world of Kenshi is one of brutal hostility to you. A wasteland that has death lasers raining from the sky, acid rain that will flay the skin off of you. This is a world that is absolutely memorable and wants you dead. So do everything in your power to prevent that as you make a name for yourself. And it feels like it has endless possibilities with it because everyone's story is going to be a little different. I mean, my story was that I was a robot that spent many real-world hours grinding away at a little piece of iron so that I could get strong enough to hold a sword roughly the size of a dude to start going on a vigilante crusade to cut down all the racists in the wasteland. And that was fun for me. This game is definitely about grind, but it's also about the experience and how every single person is going to have a different one. Are you going to be the person who just stands around next to town and being some boring trader? Or are you going to eke out into the wasteland and create a war band or your own town? Are you going to be someone who goes out and happens to be friends with the weird empire cultists who are very much against everyone who's not human and male? Or are you going to be like me and cut them all down for being a bunch of bigots? Are you going to be the people who try and free all the slaves? Are you going to try and put an end to all the evil fog monsters? Are you going to be Beep? If you're going to be Beep, I want to shake your hand because Beep is amazing. I love him. Kenshi is a game about experiences, and experiences mean a lot to me. It's a game about basically infinite amounts of storytelling, and it's a world that has so much rich lore and intricate history and interesting politics and relationships with everyone at the top that are well beyond your reach, and slowly scratching your way across that desert, getting marginally stronger bit by bit until you can stand across from them and cut them down and take their throne for your own. Kenshi is a game about stories. I carved mine out across that wasteland, and if you enjoy stories, I think you'd probably like to do it too. That said, like I like to do, even with games I like, I gotta point out the issues. There's not really any controller support, so if you're like me and you like a controller for comfort, or because like me your hands are basically broken, yeah, you're gonna have to mouse and keyboard it. Now fortunately, the game does play pretty much exclusively with the mouse, and I can work with that, but I could not for the life of me find a good mouse speed for this game. Like, either your mouse was too slow or your mouse rotation for the camera was way too fast. There was no middle ground, and there was no camera rotation versus actual like mouse movement being separate options, and it made me feel a little bit queasy having to do that. Unfortunately, that kind of sucks, and it is not a remotely well optimized game, but for how special it is, for the world it creates, and for the infinite storytelling possibilities that it presents, Kenshi is really something special. Number 3, Lufia 2, The Rise of the Sinestrals. A few years ago, I played Lufia for the first time, and it got on my Game of the Year list, and this one deserves a spot as well. It is an incredibly fun Super Nintendo RPG that isn't really like anything else on the system. Exploration is kind of like a turn-based rogue-style game with really in-depth puzzles. Equipment, for some reason, has like special active abilities that make you kind of avoid the more powerful stuff because they just give you stats, whereas the weaker stuff will give you different ways to tackle combat. Outside of combat, you get active items that allow you to handle puzzle solving, and it almost feels like a very early proto Wild Arms, and I freaking love Wild Arms. This game has so many interesting, complex mechanics that are just by the wayside too, that you can just choose to interact with or not. It has a very sort of laissez-faire their attitude towards how you interact with it for the most part. There's an entire Pokemon style mechanic where you get monsters that you can raise and transform into different stuff, and they'll just passively attack enemies for you as part of your team, or you could totally ignore that. Or everything about this game feels effortless, and it's so nonchalant in how it approaches everything and just gives it to you to let you explore it and interact with it your way. And it's an incredibly deep game because of it. The sprite work is beautiful, the enemies are very, very cool. There are two things about this game I don't necessarily like, however. First of all, it is a prequel, and because of that, we kind of already know how the story ends. So yeah, it feels a little toothless in its plot because of that. As well, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the puzzles. As much as this game does like to just shrug and say interact with this game how much you want, the puzzles are always at the forefront, and some of them are really brutally hard. I had a lot of trouble with this. Now, I'm certainly a dumb person who has trouble with a lot of puzzles, but this game, I had to pause and just wrap my head around the events that were going on, and it was too much for me at times. That said, Lufia 2 is truly a unique RPG on the Super Nintendo, and I think it's a must-have for anyone collecting for RPGs or the Super Nintendo, or really anything good. Number 2. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. This game was awesome. First of all, I freaking love the Yakuza games, so that's a no-brainer. Second of all, it's an RPG, so obviously I'm going to like this game an awful lot. And it takes place in Hawaii, which is one of the few places in the world outside my door I've actually gone to. And I feel like it gives a fairly accurate representation of Hawaii. When I went there, 10, 15 years ago now, the two things I remember the most about my trip was, first of all, it was the first and only time I've ever seen a cockroach, and those things are huge and terrifying looking. But I remember just seeing shanty towns all along the beaches, and just how this was a very, very kind of sad from a humanity perspective place, because there were clearly people not having their needs met. This game tries to emphasize the fact that Hawaii is not the perfect paradise everyone likes to think it is. And I really appreciate the honest representation that this game tries to show, warts and all. I'm not gonna lie, I cried at Kazuma Kiryu's story, but I also think that this new design he has is, to me, kind of the perfect, most real representation he's ever had in a character model. Like, to me, this new Kiryu rocking the distinguished grays is gonna be the definitive Kiryu. Sort of like how in Yakuza 0, that is like the definitive Majima to me. Like, I just can never get used to that bowl cut he has. And that's not even to say that this game has basically every game put into it as well. It's an RPG, it's an open world sandbox game. It has Crazy Taxi in it for some reason. It has Pokemon. It has basically every kind of game you would ever want rolled into one in this amazing environment with these great characters and this totally amazing and this very beautiful story. Also, it's like the only game I think I've ever played that featured Danny Trejo, and that's gotta be worth an award right there. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth is easily one of the best games I've played this year. Like always, I do have to point out a couple flaws though. First of all, it doesn't run great on a Steam Deck. It has performance issues all over the place, and the game world is just so big that it really has trouble keeping a stable frame rate in some of the more busy areas, no matter what you set the settings to. Other than that, this game was just an amazing trip with just so much to do and see in such a beautiful location, and it felt honest about its location and its characters, and it was just a very authentic kind of game for me. As much as I'm absolutely frustrated with Sega right now because of how they're treating their IPs, Yakuza is the one thing they seem to respect, and this game shows a great deal of it. So I guess they're kind of lucky they have it. And here we are, my number 1 game of the year. Let me be perfectly clear about something about myself. I am an unbelievably impatient human being. If I ever lose an hour or more of gameplay, either because I forget to save or whatever, there is a basically 100% chance I will never play that game again, because I don't want to have to re-experience things I've already done before, because to me, games are all about the experience, and having to retread stuff you've already seen and done is like the antithesis of an experience. So please understand that it means quite a lot that when I went through and played Omori, through no fault of the games, I lost my save data 4 times. Once in the penultimate dungeon, and I still needed to play this game because I needed to know how this story ended. It was such an interesting story about interesting characters in a fantastical world, and I had to experience it and know how it ended. Omori is a game that's very similar to the previous year winner, Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass, in the sense that it's a surreal, bright, colorful, goofy, happy-go-lucky game with some quirky humor that's hiding a much darker, more meaningful message and story to tell. It's a game that features a pretty unique cast of characters in an interesting world with different environments for every single chapter. So the first chapter you're like in a forest, then you're in space, then you're in a castle. It's all over the place and interesting, and it has some fascinating interstitial stages that kind of warp your understanding of how the game works, because it feels like it's playing on multiple levels, and that's because it kind of is. And every single step of the way it kept me guessing as to what was going to go on and how this was going to end, and I was completely invested in it. There are two things I cared less for in this game. First of all, one of its core mechanics in combat is this emotion system that kind of gives you like background stat buffs and debuffs depending on what your character's emotions are, and outside of one boss fight, I don't think I ever actually meaningfully interacted with this system in any way. It's just not really used all that much in a meaningful way. It's just sort of there outside of one fight that kind of requires you to know how it is, or you're going to be really, really in a bad spot. The only other thing I don't necessarily like is that this is a game that has multiple endings, and if you want to see everything in the game, which is to say about half the content, you just have to decide whether you want one ending or another, and like half the game is just locked off to you as like bonus content for the other ending. I'm not so much a big fan of that, especially because like half the content that you could experience and half the game that is just not available to you is pretty much locked away behind what is an objectively bad decision to make. But at the same time, in a kind of weird narrative sense, that's sort of what the game is about. Like, if you want that escapism to see what this game is about and what's beyond the curtain, you have to make that bad decision. And in that regard, it does put you in the place of the character on a much deeper level. I really appreciate the complexity of that and how it really does make you the main character. But I still wish I didn't have to make a bad decision just to see half the game. And how if I chose to just make the good decision, which is ultimately what I did, that there were so many questions left unanswered and things that remained unseen. Similar to Undertale before it, similar to Earthbound, similar to Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass, Omori is a deeply meaningful game that has a great deal of emotion behind it, and if you're like me and you can emotionally connect with it and you need to know how the story ends, it will have you from beginning to end. I mean, it certainly did for me, someone who lost his playthrough 4 times. And this game is more than happy to play with your preconceived notions about what you need to do and what you should do, and there's always like secrets going on in the background that if you're willing to look for, you can find some really interesting background stuff. I love how many like just small bonus things there are in this game if you're prepared to look for them. This game looks small and quirky and happy-go-lucky, and while its tone is a lot more twisted than that and a lot deeper and a lot more emotional, like that change in tone, this game is a lot bigger than you initially think it is, and it's a lot more than you initially think it is. And Omori truly is a very special game that hit with me on a very, very deeply emotional level. And it's also the only game I've ever played that accurately depicts just how frustrating and time-consuming it would be to chop down a tree using only a butter knife. It took me a couple hours. Still, it was an experience. And that was my Game of the Year list. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, feel free to drop a like, subscribe, do all that good nonsense. Tell me what your Game of the Years are, because seriously, there's infinite number of good games out there in spite of what companies seem to be doing more and more each year, and I'd like to play the good ones that I haven't heard of. I'd also greatly appreciate it if you subscribed and checked out my Twitch stream sometime, maybe, when I'm playing some weird Mega Man nonsense you've never heard of, or other random stuff I find to play primarily as research for videos and stuff in the future. And if you really want to make my day, check out the show's PayPal, Patreon, or Ko-fi to help support me doing other random nonsense. Doing so gets you on the Discord, which means you get to see this video early, like all the awesome people who've supported me in the past. Plus, it helps me keep paying for games and rent and stuff, which is important when it comes to making videos about games and being alive. Either way, I really appreciate you watching this, and I hope it was interesting to you, and ideally, maybe it'll show you your next favorite game. But yeah, yeah, in a year where there's been a lot of really bad stuff happening, both in video games and just in my life and stuff, I still found some really fun games, and I hope that you might give these a shot. Either way, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, Internet.